Hello, everyone. Just take a couple minutes here to let people join us and let me get Scott in here. I'm getting my tea ready. Scott, go ahead and request to join. We can go and get you in here. All right, here we go. Scott, it said unable to join. Let me try again. Did you come in? There we go. Cool.
Hello.
Hello.
Can I do it from the side, or am I on the side?
You're on the side.
I'm on the side. Let's figure that out. I think I'll be good.
I can adjust mine a little bit here. Do you want me to try to go on the side, or would it help you?
Maybe try, but I don't know if it'll change. But try, yeah.
Let me see.
No.
No.
You are now on the side. It's fine.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Yeah, this looks good.
Howdy.
Hey. What you drinking? Oh.
I was just about to make a bowl of matcha. In keeping with the thematic quality of tonight's call. So we'll go through a variety of different teas, I think.
Cool. I'm drinking a pressed white tea that I got in Fuzhou about this time last year. So
very nice.
Yeah. So all right. Well, I'll just jump in with a little introduction, and then we'll get going. Thank you all for joining us tonight, and welcome to this discussion of tea and meditation. My name is Miles Cramer. I'm with Dobra Tea in Asheville, North Carolina. For those joining in that are a little unfamiliar with our tea company, Dobra Tea is a tea company based out of Prague in the Czech Republic. Since the early 90s, we've been traveling to tea gardens all over the world, sourcing all the teas for our broad menu offerings. And now we are a family of full-service tea rooms across Eastern Europe and in select cities throughout the United States. I've had the opportunity to work with Dobra Tea for the last 10 years in Asheville, and in that time, I've been able to travel with the company to China, Japan, and northern Thailand. And so in this time of working with Dobra Tea and working with tea in general, I've built this passion about this interest in the subject that we're going to talk about tonight, tea and Buddhism. Specifically, I really enjoy studying the monasteries that have really helped continue the process of tea culture and these monasteries in China and then in Japan, and just exploring the ideas of how Buddhism has informed tea culture and tea ceremony. But I am by no means an expert on this subject. I've just read a couple books, but I'm by no means an expert. So I'm really excited to talk with Scott tonight about this subject. So yeah, I'd like to introduce Scott Norton. If you could maybe just tell a little bit about, just introduce yourself, some tea companies that you've been affiliated with, and some experience with this subject that we're going to be talking about tonight.
Thank you, Miles. Hi, everyone. You're seeing me mid-warming of the bowl of tea. Miles asked me to join in on this talk today. And just to give you a little bit about myself and my background, I've been a lifetime tea drinker, kind of grew up drinking it, and started working in the tea industry in the late 2000s, so probably 2008. At that time, I was doing a lot of research in East Asian history, attempting a PhD at UC Berkeley. And it was around this time, while I was working in the tea industry, while I was working at trying to get a PhD in East Asian history, I did my first of many trips to East Asia, in this case to Korea, and had my first experience going to a tea farm. We'll actually mention the tea farm itself because it's one of the historical farms that was one of the touch points for tea culture, at least in Korea. And there I really saw firsthand where tea and in this case, Zen or Son monasticism came together. And it really, I had read about the history of tea and Buddhism. I had read about, the sort of idea of tea and Zen being of the same flavor. I'd even been practicing Zen Buddhism for a number of years prior to that first trip. And, but it's not until you actually have the full-on experience of it. So at that time, I was working with Red Blossom Tea Company based in San Francisco. Later, I helped start up West China Tea Company that's based in Austin, Texas. And I have affiliations with other tea houses. I work with a number of them here in New York City, mostly working around their education and doing kind of tea outreach. We're doing it virtually today. So
yeah, cool.
Yeah.
Well, sweet. Those are some great tea companies that I've heard about as well. Well, so let's go ahead and just jump into the subject matter today. Talking about tea and Buddhism. Kind of as we talked a little bit about, the history of Buddhism begins in India, and but for our purposes today, we can just start with China, because we're going to be talking about tea. So we'll just start with the history of China. So I mean, in Buddhism in India is like what, the 6th century BC, something like that. And so, so when does it start to come into China? And then when does tea start to be used in these monasteries?
Yeah, both excellent questions. So you have the emergence of from the historical Buddha in the 6th century BC, Buddhism in India, and it takes a while for it to move from India to parts of Central Asia and parts of Southeast Asia. But by the 1st century CE, you have on record Buddhists making their way into the capital of then the Eastern Han. So that would have been Luoyang. I think the first record is around 65 CE. And these are Buddhist missionaries, Buddhist monks who are coming from Central Asia, probably by way of the Silk Road, so an overland route. And in many ways, this is not only, the route for Buddhism, the route for silk and commerce, but it's also the route by which things such as tea culture makes its way into the interior of China and into southern China. And there in Luoyang, you have the establishment of the first Buddhist monastery and first Buddhist temple, Chinese Buddhist temple, essentially, the White Horse Monastery in Luoyang. So, and it's from there that you have the beginnings of Buddhism in China. But as it pertains to tea, and you know, we can talk a little bit more about that. I guess that's the subject for tonight's talk. Tea has existed in China and in areas that are now modern-day China, in parts of southern Yunnan, for probably about 6,000 years. So the idea of having tea in Buddhism is pretty late in the game of tea's history. But the idea of tea being used as something that you might find either, you know, in the use of shamanism, the use of as a medicine, or maybe even the use as something to, you know, keep the mind awake, whether it be during, you know, day-to-day tasks or during meditation. That had been something that had been in Chinese culture for a long time. And you have histories of that going well back, you know, beyond, let's say, like the 300s BC, 400s BC, where they're cultivating tea, not just having, you know, wild arbor tea, but cultivating tea in what is modern day Sichuan province. So, but the merging of the two cultures is pretty early on in Buddhism's arrival into China. We
So
do see
it's pretty immediate.
It's pretty immediate, yeah. And I think part of that is that if you look at how Buddhism makes its way into China, it kind of arrives at a time in which Taoism's having a moment. Taoism being the sort of following of the way, looking at nature and learning from that, and you know, understanding movement of energy throughout nature and in the body. This is a complete generalization of what Taoism is. My Taoist friends will go after me about this, but but in a Taoist temple and in Taoist practice, tea was already being used and had already been recognized as something that can improve energy flow within the body, and was considered to be one of these noted medicinal herbs which you could find at a Taoist temple. Being that Taoism and practitioners of the Tao, many were already involved in the sort of search for things like elixirs of immortality, and understanding how, you know, pharmacopoeia could have an influence on the body energy. So tea was already in that. And by the time that Buddhism comes into China in the 1st century, it begins to closely associate itself, probably just because Taoism is already a very practiced worldview at that point. And it begins to take on things of Taoism, and to some extent Taoism begins to sort of cross-pollinate with Buddhism. So you see a lot of shared visual culture, but also a lot of shared language. Especially during the early days of Buddhism in China, a lot of the words and terminology, and even just the way that things were described as they came to China through what was essentially a foreign religion or foreign philosophy, were then sort of co-opted, adapted, and roughly translated in ways that would maybe make sense to folks who might already understand the sort of terminology around Taoism. So there's already a shared culture by the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd centuries, Eastern Han, and then later into the 6 dynasties. So,
okay.
Yeah. So.
Well, I'll let you drink that bowl there. Take away. Yeah, and so that's interesting. You know, so it kind of seems almost as if Taoism kind of set the stage for this association.
Yeah.
And then so coming into well, actually, so while we're here in this time period in like the 4th century, I want to ask some questions about the Bodhidharma.
Yeah.
The Bodhidharma seems to me, in anything I read about him, one of these figures in history that, is it, what's fact, what's fiction, what's myth, what's illusion, what kind of a Jesus figure. I don't know. Maybe that's a broad comparison, but
Yeah.
just talk a little bit on the Bodhidharma. I mean, because, the Bodhidharma, I believe it's in Japanese culture, he's credited as the creator of tea, correct?
Yeah.
It's in a myth, right?
Yeah.
I mean, the eyebrow story or the eyelid story.
Yes, yes. So
but
I guess
talk a little bit about the Bodhidharma.
Yeah. I guess to kind of backfill that story, if that's helpful, and that is,
please.
we have in the history of Buddhism and really Chan Buddhism or Zen Buddhism, Son Buddhism, meditation Buddhism, we have in that history the emergence of this individual, Bodhidharma, who is said to have come from the West. And in some chronicles of his life, he's described as this blue-eyed barbarian. And it's a sense that maybe he was someone from India or maybe somebody from Central Asia. He came during a time, during the Western Way, or Six Dynasties period, right before the Tang period, in the 5th or 6th century. He came to China and purportedly, let's assume he's real, let's maybe see that he could also be fake, came to China during the 5th and 6th century and came through what was probably Central Asia, and for a period of time was traveling throughout China, and kind of, in a sort of splashy way. People were seeing him, and as the chronicles talk about, people would encounter him and were kind of bewildered about his approach to Buddhism. It was different from an orthodox Buddhism where you'd read a lot of sutras, where you would maybe give an offering of something, and you would do all of these highly structured rituals. Not to say that that's not Buddhism, but his form of Buddhism, on the other hand, was more of, my body is my practice. And really, my practice is his particular one was to sit and meditate. And he eventually winds up in what is the Shaolin Temple, known for their Shaolin Kung Fu, and he's kind of linked to that as well. And he goes through a process of sitting for 9 years solid. His focus is to kind of find that moment of deep concentration where one detaches from body and mind, and almost to an extent where in that detachment you kind of find where the two exist together. And in Buddhism, this is the sort of understanding of dualism and non-dualism that comes at a moment of awakening. The realization that things are, both two and one kind of thing. He's credited, the myth around this is that he's credited for linking tea and Buddhism, and that in that 9 years of meditation, where he's staring at a wall or focusing at a wall, in the 7th year he falls asleep, and in a fit of rage upon waking up, the dude rips off his eyelids and throws them to the side. And from that, you have tea leaves sprouting up. So, and this sounds right? And especially to us, and we're like, why would you rip off your eyes? But then you think, like, he also had a follower who, like, ripped off his arm, to show that he was really, a good follower of his teacher. But when you think of it, what is tea doing? You get sleepy as you're meditating, right? We've all been there if you've sat and meditated. And for somebody who's being really intense about it, ripping off your eyelids is, well, I'm going to banish my chance of sleeping. I will be only awake. Tea kind of does that. And I'll know because it's 7:30 now, and I just had a bowl of matcha, and then I'm going to have some other types of teas as this talk goes on. So we'll know that I won't have the ability to necessarily sleep or fall asleep. So that link is made, but it's coming at a time that Chan Buddhism is already beginning to have its sort of early start in China. We start seeing Chan Buddhism sort of separate out from the rest of Orthodox Buddhism. And a lot of this comes, again, from interaction between Chinese scholars and non-Chinese, either Buddhist monks or missionaries. Part of it is that you have Chinese Buddhists now going to East Asia, to Central Asia and to Southeast Asia, and they're learning directly. But then you also have the confluence from trade of different cultures coming into China and learning this. So Bodhidharma could be real, he could be fake. What we do know, however, is that by the 5th and 6th century, that link between tea and Buddhism is much stronger. And that link between tea being used as a meditative aid is certainly part of the Buddhist experience in China. So, yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, just, real quick before we move on, do you think that he was a real person?
What's that?
Before we move on, do you think that he was a real person?
I don't want to be mean and say I don't care, but I think there are,
Okay.
I think
That's
there
fair
are
enough. Fair enough.
so many mytho-histories in the realm of Buddhism and even outside of the realm of Buddhism.
Yeah.
He's probably fake, but he's probably a combination of multiple characters. And even Bodhidharma, is purported to say that he's 150 years old by the time that he's like marching into China. Whenever somebody says that to you, or whenever you see that in a text, it usually means this guy's probably 3 or 4 people, and here's all their stories combined into one person. It's the same with like Shennon, this mythical character who finds tea and puts it in his mouth and forever changes the history of Chinese traditional medicine. So yeah.
Okay. Yes. So you don't care. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter.
Yeah. At the end of the day, if Buddha existed, it doesn't matter. That's the other thing. It's like, the only Buddha that really should matter is the one that sits inside of you. So
yeah. Well said.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, so moving forward on this timeline of history, you talked a little bit about the kind of early developments and the interactions, and then so moving forward into the Tang dynasty, and then I'll just kind of do the broad question, the Tang, and then into the Song dynasty as well.
Yeah.
Describe a little bit about the Chinese interaction with tea through this as culture is starting to expand, trade is starting to expand. Through the Song dynasty, we have a stronger emergence of the literati and something I know that you are passionate about, the emergence of teaware being central to the practice system. I know that's a huge question, but so how does all of that, as we enter into the Tang dynasty, what are we seeing with tea culture and Buddhism as well?
It's an interesting arc because by the early Tang, you have the emergence of Buddhism as a very widely accepted worldview, distinctive within the ruling class, within the scholar class, within the monastic class, and then also begins to become popular religion as well. It may have already been, but in the way that written history comes about, you don't oftentimes see that. Tea also begins to see that sort of same movement, and that is, it was popular within a ruling class, and it was popular within like folk medicine, right? You could see it on the highs and the lows, but you didn't see it in such a broad and distinctive swath that you could say there's tea culture. It was just kind of peppered in throughout all of the different types of culture that were going on, medicine culture, beverage culture, you name it. Tea, on the other hand, during the Tang, was becoming a major trade product. You see the emergence of the tea horse road in a big way. You see the use of tea in all forms of daily life, whether it's a drink, whether it's a medicine, whether it's a ritual offering, whether it's something, again, to kind of keep you awake during a meditative state. And so it begins to show up, not just in text, but also in poems. It shows up in art and art history that we find now. And the association with Buddhism at that time was pretty strong. You have instances where, let's say in Buddhist monasteries, you see it being used as not only an offering to, a statue of a Buddha or a statue of a Bodhisattva, because especially in China, traditionally and historically, the offering of wine was given to ancestors. This comes from a Confucian practice. And so, because you can't have wine in a Buddhist context, the offering of tea was very popular. You also see at this moment tea being used, again, as a meditative aid, and you see this in the records. One of the earliest Táng Buddhist records that we have that mentions tea is from the abbot Baizong in the 700s, I believe. And in this record, essentially monastic guidelines, the do's and don'ts if you're a monk, essentially, there's over 200 mentions of tea in this text. And again, a lot of it is just like, it's kind of placed very commonly. So the idea is that, you'd have it before eating, you'd have it before meditation, you would offer it to people who are coming to you, from other monasteries. So it's very much part of the monastic culture. You see this too, and also the emergence of Konan discussions. And a good example is the monk Zhao Zhou Kongshen, who is famous for his have a bowl of tea koan, where a monk comes from another monastery and he's like, where have you come from? Oh, from another monastery, have a bowl of tea. Monk from his monastery comes in and he's like, where have you come from? And he's like, I come from here. And he's like, have a bowl of tea. And somebody's asking him like, why'd you ask them both to have a bowl of tea? And he's like, well, essentially it's going back to that notion of non-dualism and equanimity, that when, in a Buddhist context, we offer things in sort of an equal way. But then you also see, someone like Lu Yu with his Cha Jing, the classic of tea. He originally comes from a Buddhist monastery. He leaves at a very early age, but he grew up in tea culture and grew up in the tea culture of sort of southern China style or eastern southern China style tea culture. So he was very aware of the different wares that you might find in a temple or within, a scholar's space. And already by that time, not only is it linked to Buddhism, but we still see the vestiges and still see how tea has kind of become this focal point for all different types of ways of viewing the world. The brazier that he uses, his famous Feng Lu, of which I have a Song Dynasty, modern Song Dynasty replica of Lu Yu's Feng Lu sitting next to me. So cool. The thing that I'm boiling water with, essentially. It's a tripod, and the tripod shape comes from a ritual vessel that predates, even Taoism. And he's bringing this into tea. The tripod itself has trigrams written on it. So these are sort of like to make sure that the energies are focused and that, water and fire are balanced out and, wind is involved there too. So, and he's already bringing this into a world of kind of medicine, kind of magic. And this is a world that Taoism and Buddhism and sort of shamanism and sagacious qualities within a Chinese lexicon exist. So you begin to see an early eclecticism emerge from him as well. And it's also around this time, during the Tang, that you have Buddhism not only coming into China in a big way, but it's also leaving China in a big way, and it's leaving with China's stamp on it. China, for centuries, was it's still known to this day as Zhongguo, the Central Kingdom. And the reason why it was the Central Kingdom is because the kingdoms around it were vassal states or tribute states. And they would pay tribute to the Chinese court, in this case, the Tang court. And in return, they'd get things like Chinese technology and Chinese culture, Chinese language, Chinese writing systems, Buddhism. And so by the Tang period, you see places like Korea and places like Japan beginning to take on Tang-styled courts to legitimate their own power. And part of that is bringing tea, because it is very much linked to the health of the nation, the sort of, as a medicine. But it's also linked to the culture of the court, in that the refinement of the court is found also in, the tea ceremony or the production of tea. And at that time, it was being compressed into bricks, and then being ground into a powder, and then just being boiled. The whisk comes later in the song. So, yeah. So you start seeing people like Kukai, you start seeing people like Saicho. They come in during this time period into China, bringing back their version of Buddhism that they find in places like, Xi'an or Chang'an or Eastern China with Taishan, and bringing that back. Most of it's esoteric Buddhism, mind you, too. So bringing back something that is already kind of esoteric and, cool, but also could potentially be a medicine as well, was very important at that time.
Well, we'll get to Kukai and Saicho in just a second. I want to kind of go back to something you said I thought was really interesting about. I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on Lu Yu. I feel like he gets a lot of the focus in a lot of these conversations. But one thing I think was interesting that you said, that it seems almost like you were saying he started to bring this eclectic nature to tea culture. And I mean, because one thing about Lu Yu, I feel like, on kind of surface studies of tea history, you say, oh, with the writing of the Cha Jing, we have the beginning of tea culture.
Yeah.
Lu Yu was actually, tea culture was already beginning and peaking, and Lu Yu's writing was, it was kind of at the top of the mountain in a way.
Yeah. Yeah.
And, but I thought it was really interesting what you said about how, but I think you can truly credit him as this kind of turning point of tea culture, of this eclectic, what you said, this eclectic nature to tea, that it kind of brings it out of the medicinal state into the poetic state.
Yes. Yes. And I like how you call it a poetic state. So I refer to him as eclectic in a sense because, yes, he's reporting on something that is already there in a sense. He didn't invent it. He definitely kind of codified aspects of it, because what he was doing is going through and kind of, if you read the Cha Jing, a lot of it is just grading. A lot of it is and most of it is not on tea. Most of it's on what watering you use. He recognizes very early on that it's not about the tea, it's about the water. And so most of it's about, where do you get your water? And, is it from a spring? Is it from a river? Is it from an eddy? Is it from a lake?
Part of the river.
Yeah, what part of the river, what part of the lake, and he's also adding salt into his tea. He removes all the other stuff like green onions and roots and things like that, but he still throws in a little bit of salt. But what he's doing is he's talking about all of the components that you need to make tea. And it becomes famous to the point where, after his life, he's revered as this tea sage, and you see the printings of the Cha Jing being hung in tea houses. So in many ways, he's kind of he reports on it, and then it becomes popular, and then all of a sudden you have this sort of user's manual of how to make tea in a poetic way, right?
Yeah.
He's doing it in a refined way. He's telling you, you can use, iron, you can use silver, or you can use gold. And there's, if you're really rich, go for gold because it's great. But I'm not so rich, and I like the taste of silver, right?
Yeah.
He's also talking about, like, use this sieve for the water. And it's interesting because, we think of it today as like, oh yeah, you want to make sure that there isn't stuff in your water when you boil it and you turn it into tea. But that practice that Lu Yu's referring to, of this sort of mesh sieve that's made out of a thing of wood and then stretched onto this sort of hoop of wood, is this fine mesh of silk. He's getting that from Buddhist practice of, you would run your water through a mesh sieve prior to using it, because you didn't want to ingest any of the little animals that might be in that water, the ones that you couldn't see. And this is sort of the compassion of, the Bodhisattva playing out, and you see it being brought into tea culture at that time. But yeah, he's talking about not only the how-to, but also, like, how do you really want to do it? Like, if you're a little fancy, this is how you do it. And he also talks about what happens if you don't have some things. The latter half of the Cha Jing is just about, and if you don't have, a thing to make tea on, make it on a rock. If you don't have a stand,
he's opening it up to everyone, really.
Yeah, just kind of bring it out into the world. That's the other thing. He's one of these guys who likes to make tea outside. And so how do you do that is a big question. So.
Yeah. And so one other thing about Lu Yu, and I'll use this to pivot into Kukai and Saicho. This idea that Lu Yu was born in a monastery, or he was an orphan, but he's brought into the monastery.
Yep.
And so he's raised in this kind of monastic life, but he ultimately abandons it.
Yeah.
And you see this. Say what?
He becomes a circus clown for a while.
Yeah, exactly. He goes on a traveling circus troupe.
Yeah.
And so I feel like you see this in tea sages throughout history of they're raised in this monastic life, but then they venture out into the world, and but teaism really becomes this passion for them. So with that being said, we'll actually then pivot and just kind of keep that in mind as we talk about something down the road. We'll revisit that down the road. In this late Tang period, specifically 803 AD, you have Kukai and Saicho, two Buddhist monks, devout Buddhist monks, traveling to China to study the Buddhism of China, to inform Japanese culture, and to, to bring these texts to the Nara court, but ultimately to create their own forms of Buddhism. But with this journey, you have the beginnings of tea in Japan. So you're then starting to see this same cycle in Japan of it's starting as a very strict monastic practice, and then it opens up into Cha no Yu. And so in this conversation, when we reach Cha no Yu, I almost feel as if this trajectory of Lu Yu's life is almost applicable to people like Rikyu. I don't know. But I'll let you take it away on that with those thoughts.
I think there are qualities. No one's analogous to another one.
Exactly.
It's not a one-to-one for any of us, but you have in the first decade of the 800s, I think it was 803 to 805, you have 4 state-sponsored or government-sponsored trips, expeditions from Japan to China. And, again, a lot of this is we're going to Zhongguo, we're going to the Central Kingdom. and we're kind of a little bit of a vassal state or a little bit of a tribute state, or, you know, also it's kind of going to a world where we can get a lot of new technology. A lot of the folks who are on board these ships are kind of going there to get the new ideas and the new technology of this world, which is at that time the world's most advanced, you know, scientific realm or religious realm or statecraft realm. So they're trying to get this. Saicho is born pretty much into monastic life and begins to study Buddhism in, as most of this, you know, as most of these stories go, feels like he can't go so far in the confines of what is known in Japan, and he needs to go to the source, at least to the source of his Buddhism, which is China. And so he attempts to go to China first in 1803, not 1803, 803, and fails and has to try maybe 2 more times, or bad seas. So he tries 2 more times and he gets in the next time, and makes his way into China, and doesn't stay for that long. He's there for about 6 months. He goes in at the same time that Kukai is going in. Kukai is a little bit younger. He was born and eventually makes his way into a life of monasticism, and makes his way into China, goes to Chang'an and studies in the area around Chang'an, where he learns about esoteric Buddhism. Both of them are learning about esoteric Buddhism, but he's learning specifically about Tantric Buddhism and sort of Mandala Buddhism, and much of which was purportedly came to him in a dream while he was still a child in Japan, and this sort of informed his journey. And during their stay there, they encounter tea culture. They encounter tea culture in the way that you'd find it during the Tang period. So again, it's very medicinal. It's very geared towards, you know, we're going to give it as an offering. We're going to incorporate it into monastic life. It's readily available for them at that point. And purportedly, they come back with tea seeds, and they plant these tea seeds. Now, whether or not this is true, and whether or not, you know, was there tea in Japan already? These are kind of the questions that we need to ask. I think it's very easy for historians of tea to say, yes, this was, you know, Kukai and Saicho bring tea back, because we see tea culture begin to take off in Japan at that time, at least.
Convenient story.
What's that?
It's a convenient story.
It's a convenient story. But the thing is that, you know, we also have an edict by an emperor, you know, maybe 10 years after, 20 years after, who says, okay, well, you know, now we're going to have tea produced exclusively for the court, and it's going to be in these, you know, regions around Heian-kyo, Nara, Osaka, Yamato, Yamashiro, and in the Kanai region. And he's saying this, and when you see the amount of tea that comes in, it's significant. Now, if you know how tea propagates, it's a slow grower. You probably don't have a viable tea plant until, you know, at the very least about 5 to 7 years, and really it's not that good. 20 years and beyond is better, and, you know, 50 to 100 years is great. Anything beyond that is hip hooray. So what we're probably seeing is that there was tea. It was probably commonly consumed. It was probably used as kind of either a medicine or a beverage, and probably not that great. And when you have people like Kukai, when you have people like Saicho, and then you have other people like them who are coming into contact with this, it's an act of verification. It's like, hey, these guys have tea. Isn't that great? Saicho even there's record that Saicho even sends about 10 pounds of tea to an acolyte of Kukai in I think like 815 or something like that. And so like to even have 10 pounds of tea is, you know,
Yeah.
it's kind of significant. And also like when Kukai and Saito come back, like they both come back during a time when like if you were to travel with a tea seed and then plant it, it wouldn't be planted at a time that would be a good time to plant it either. So it's like all these little factors point towards maybe no. But what you see during the life of Kukai and Saito, and what you start seeing after in a much bigger way, is tea beginning to be used by the courts of Japan, beginning to be part of monastic culture in Japan. And even at this time, we didn't really have Chan Buddhism in Japan at this point. We had esoteric Buddhism, but you have a very strong link of esoteric Buddhism and tea being forged at this time. And that doesn't really shake until about the 1300s. Mm-hmm. So, yeah.
Yeah. Well, and so, you know, that then you have a Sai, the Travels of a Sai, and you know, often in books that you read, you have a Sai credited as the true beginning of tea. You know, you often read that, you know, with Kukai and Saicho, their credit is bringing tea first, but then it didn't really catch on until the time of Sai, and then you start to have this whole arc of the story of tea in Japan, starting in I guess the late 12th century. And then that enters into the phases that tea appreciation, completely leaving the monasteries and turning into a party drug in a way. You know, and then it returns back to a spiritual practice with Murata Juko or Shuko. So I guess let's pick up the story there in the beginnings of with Juko and the beginnings of Chano Yu.
I like to go 2 steps back before I go 1 step further. And that is, no, it's perfectly fine. And that is, you have Juko or Shuko in the 1400s and very early 1500s writing and practicing about tea. And he's talking about tea in a very specific manner and flavor. And what he's referring, or when he talks about tea, as you mentioned, tea at that moment had kind of become the new party drug, right? I hate to put it like that, but it was. You had these crazy mono-awase, you know, tea grading parties where you would have, you know, 10 different types of teas. One would be from Uji, all of the others would be from everywhere else, and then you'd have to figure out which one's from Uji, right? And the winner would get lavish goods, and they would then bestow that onto one of their servants just to show that they're, you know, good people. Deference. It was very splashy, and you saw this in Buddhist worlds, and you saw this in, you know, at this time you had the Buddhist scholar at this time from the 1300s to the 1500s was this sort of tastemaker at this moment. People were even throwing the suffix ami at the end of their name because ami was linked to Amida Buddha. So if you were linked to Buddhism, you all of a sudden knew what you were talking about, kind of thing. So these folks were making the sort of studiolos. I forget the specific name for this in Japanese, but they were making these lavish rooms in which people could regale guests. By the time of Murata Shuko, so in the mid 1400s, culture was beginning to shift. And part of this was because you had a lot of war, you had a lot of devastation in Japan at this time. And you had a lot of disruption of where power was located. So the thing that may have made sense, you know, 50 years ago, 20 years ago, the lavish parties, so on and so forth, were seen as decadent now. And people like Ikkyu, who was a monk during the 1400s and possibly a teacher of Shuko, was already moving towards gotta be a hermit, I'm going to make a little hut. I'm not going to give people Incas. I'm not going to give them, you know, transmit the Dharma. If you have the Dharma and if you have Buddha nature, you know, right? Or I know and you know, kind of thing. Juko comes in at this time and begins to apply these sorts of methods to tea, and that is, let's take away all the artifice, let's take away the finery, let's move it into a shoin, which is this small study or sort of side room, and we can really only fit 4 to 6 people in this. So we're not showing off at this point. And rather than have lavish goods there, we're going to have very sort of meager goods. We might throw in a Chinese ware here and there just to sort of typify things. But he was more concerned about how do you place something so beautiful in an instance or in a situation or an environment that is rustic and refined, but also what might be described as withered. How do you describe something that's fleeting? And it plays very much into this Buddhist notion of, you know, the suffering of daily life, the suffering of life, the pain of death, and the realization that all of this is part of the world around us. This quality of tea, which is in quite, you know, big juxtaposition to what was going on at that time, is then later taken up by folks in the merchant class. Notably Takeno-jo, who begins to turn this into what is then called wabi-cha, which is, if you know your wabi-sabi or your Japanese terminology, it's this notion again of a very rustic situation. And there he starts using common wares amongst the tea wares. So he starts using things like Korean wares, daily wares, you know, even using things like bamboo rather than a bronze vase kind of thing. He strips it down even further. And during a time period when you have so much shifting in the world, not only are people looking to Buddhism as a way to kind of better understand this life that we have, but at the same time, people began to start looking to tea as a means to kind of relocate legitimacy and relocate a discourse that, you know, other things that might be more lavish or might be more, you know, over the top might not answer to. The material world versus this sort of world of focused meditation and really diving into an art and finding enlightenment in that art. That's an old concept. It predates tea ceremony, at least in Japan. And it had become quite popular at that time to dedicate yourself fully into an art, find one's awakening in that. And so by the mid-1500s and really towards the late 1500s, you have the popularization of tea ceremony, cha-do, the way of tea, or sa-do, the way of tea. And that's when you get somebody like Senno Rikyu, who comes from merchant stock, became a Buddhist monk, and then kind of even steps away from that as he realizes that tea is his path. And he uses that as a means to negotiate with the world around him, both in terms of how do you find equanimity in a highly class-divided world? Well, it's easy. Let's cut the door down into like a little 3 by 3 foot crouching, you know, sliding door, and everybody has to crawl in. The lords and the merchants, you know, and take off your sword and take off your worldly goods before you enter. You can't even get in because the door is so small. So just hang those over there. When we enter this realm of the tea room now, we're entering as equals, and we're entering in a way that enables us to have a conversation with tea wares, with maybe a piece of Zengo, which is Zen writing, which at that point had become popular to hang into a tea room. And let's even use, you know, a bowl that might otherwise be a rice bowl, and use it in a way that a bowl that would have had the offerings given to a Buddha or Bodhisattva, let's now use that rice bowl and, you know, let's drink up in a sense. Yeah. So in that very focused world, again, we could speak on this for hours, if not days, if we wanted to. In that he created kind of a perfect realm, a sort of pure land, to use the Buddhist term, in which you can at least physically separate yourself from the world outside of the tea room and focus on the matters at hand, the things that were really mattered. And that is, you know, what happens to you when this moment is over? Who were you before this moment? And how do we link ourselves in such a way that we recognize the fleeting nature of every moment? And Senno Rikyu talks about this. He hones it in his practice. But again, like Lu Yu, like any of these tea sages, he's borrowing heavily from people who came before him. He is innovating, but he's also, his real power is that he can be eclectic too. And again, there's that eclecticism.
Yeah.
So to brew Buddhism into tea itself is an eclectic act, but then to turn it on its head and say, well, then how do we look at this from a Buddhist standpoint?
Yeah.
Is kind of the vital turn. So.
Yeah, and so this kind of brings back full circle to what I was talking about with Lu Yu, where you have these people raised a monastic life, but then they leave it and they, you know, develop this tea practice. You know, and so in this state of Chano Yu and Chado is, I mean, would you say that it's something separate from Buddhism, or is it an extension of Buddhism? Is it within the confines of Buddhism? I mean,
I don't like to make separations, and maybe that's a personal thing, but when you look at the way that these are all being discussed, there's a reductive quality because you're reducing the things down to their bare minimum. And that, you know, taken in the context of Zen, that's kind of how Zen works in a sense too. You parse things down to their bare minimum. But the fact that you're coming at this art fully knowledgeable, at least in this case of Rikyu, fully knowledgeable of Buddhism, it becomes an extension of Buddhism to an extent. It's infused with, maybe that's a better word to use.
Infused
with it. Because when you look at tea ceremony, at Chanoyu, it's also calling upon things like Shintoism. It's also calling upon things like Taoism. The way that the tea room is set up is on a bagua. There's a Tai Chi in the center. All right, so he knew this. And it's there if you know where to look. And tea continues to be that way, even to this day. You know, tea continued to develop. You had Sencha-do in Japan, you had Gong Fu Cha in China, you had the way of tea in Korea, which was largely practiced in Buddhist monasteries from the 1300s, even up to today, where tea is being used as a meditation, and the preparation of tea being used as a meditation. But it's separate, but it's also very much part of the Buddhist experience in this particular sense. You can separate the two, yes, but there's DNA in both of them.
Yeah.
Tea grew up on Buddhist monasteries. Tea wouldn't be what it is today if it didn't have the help of Buddhism. And Buddhism, to an extent, wouldn't have the proliferation and popularization, I think, if it hadn't been for tea. Qualities of both are intertwined.
Yeah.
So, yeah. And I'm drinking some Tia Guanyin, by the way. So it's speaking of Buddhism, is linked to all of this. So it's part of the culture.
Yeah. It's all connected. Well, looks like we're about to hit the 2-minute shut-off point. How should we kind of tie all this together, sum this up, or any final thoughts? I mean, moving into ceremony now, Gong Fu Cha. I mean, I'll let you have the kind of final thoughts here.
I think if we want to talk about Buddhism and tea, we can talk about it as a common thing, and we can talk about it as an elevated thing. At the core of it, though, and not to tie it up in a nice, neat bow, because nothing's neat about history.
Yeah.
History's messy. What we find is that tea is, at the end of the day, if you are performing it regularly, if you're making it regularly, it becomes a mindful act. As you continue to do this mindful act, you find yourself. And if you do it over and over and over again, you lose the self. And as you lose the self, you find the true self, the self that didn't know it was there the whole time. Hello.
Yeah, I wanted just to sum this up. Like, we got cut off.
Yeah.
So I think you're almost to the crux of your beautiful statement. So.
Oh, no worries. Good to find a unnatural cutoff sometimes. Too.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think you can link if you want to look at the big history of Buddhism and tea together. A lot of folks will say you can't have one without the other. I think to some extent there's truth behind that, right? Certainly tea was affected by Buddhism. I think where you see tea in the world had a large part to do with where you found Buddhism. It traveled the monastic routes. It traveled where monasteries were set up. If it was a Chinese-style Buddhism and it traveled somewhere, those monks probably wanted or needed tea. And so you would have the necessity and people would then have to cultivate tea. Tea at the same token is a plant. It's going to propagate wherever you put it to some extent. It's an evergreen shrub. And so you also have the history of it just being this wild thing that grew, possibly. When you look at the texts of, or the archaeological history, I shouldn't even bring in text. When you look at the archaeological evidence of where tea is, a lot of it predates Buddhism, at least as it comes into China and then into areas that had Chinese-style Buddhism. But what I think you do begin to see throughout the shared history of tea and Buddhism is that tea culture, as it comes from China, and as it then disseminates to places like Korea and Japan, begins or takes on a very distinctive Buddhist flavor. And if we're going to use that old adage, tea and Zen are of one flavor, you do begin to see Buddhism informing how tea is prepared, Buddhism informing where tea is consumed, and Buddhism informing kind of what you think about when you sit and you make tea. And even without Buddhism, I think we could sit and have tea and go like, wow, this is delicious leaf juice that I'm having. Don't I feel connected to something kind of bigger than me,
Yeah.
Whether it be nature or this sort of, greater self, or to a lesser extent, or maybe to the same extent, like it's a tiny leaf. And isn't this moment precious? Isn't it fleeting? The tea from this spring tastes different from the tea from last fall. And these are concepts that you find in Buddhism, this sense of constant change and the dying and transformation of things as they go from existence to non-existence and back into existence. That's very much part of Buddhism. But I think Buddhism gave tea the language to describe this in a way that it didn't necessarily have. Buddhism gave tea, in some extent, not all cases, but gave it sometimes a ritual, of course. And then at the same time, I think Buddhism, especially the more radical forms of Zen Buddhism, like that of EQ, and to an extent, you know, maybe even somebody like Baisao in the Edo period, these radical forms which really didn't, you know, they were informed by Buddhism, but they were really all about, like, you know, I'm a hermit and this is how I live, you know, impermanence. And that's all I know. That definitely informed tea, to the fact that, like, you know, the bowl that I'm using right now is unadorned. It's black. When I look into the center of this bowl, I contemplate on the void, you know. And the scoop that I'm using is made of a little thing of bamboo, you know. It's no longer a piece of gold that's been stretched out or, you know, embossed. It's very simple. And my favoring of, you know, rustic wares, or the fact that, like, this tea scoop has a poem on it talking about living in the mountains in a hut. You know, all of this is very much linked to a version of Buddhism that, you know, arrives in China at the same time that you have other forms like Taoism or you know, the sort of mountain sage, the sort of Sanxian. And tea is one of these things that kind of probably already woven into that fabric. But by the time that you have Buddhism arriving on the scene, Buddhism's kind of already ascribing some of this too. And so they become buddies for a long time. And maybe that's the way I can sum up this history, if there's even a need to sum up that history, is that, you know, tea is a great companion to meditation. And tea is a great companion to the meditative mind. If you slow down the cadence of your life enough, you'll find that moment where you can focus and be focused in a moment and might have that instant of awakening, whether it is led by Buddhism and knowledge of Buddhism or not. And I think tea, if we're all sitting here enjoying our cup of tea, or teapot of tea, or bowl of tea, we know that the process itself takes time. And we know that the process, if we want to do it right, comes from honing your skill a little bit and stepping into the sort of getting better acquainted with the subtle qualities of what makes one thing taste one way, what makes one thing taste a different way. And if you drink enough tea, you get to the point where you don't mind if it's, you know, sweet, and you don't mind if it's bitter. Mm-hmm. And, you know, we can link that to Buddhism too. To enjoy the good and the bad as they come, you know, the sweet and the bitter. So, but, you know, if we're going to talk about this further, and again, we could talk for days. And for those who are watching and want to learn more about this, I mean, Miles, you were saying, like, maybe you should just do a class on it. Like, maybe we should just have classes on this sort of thing. But they can still be tea talks too. But the other quality of this too is that when you see how tea changes, you know, even past Rikyu, in China, in Japan, in Korea, later in Taiwan, later throughout the rest of the world, the folks who either are Buddhist and are practicing tea, or folks who are practicing tea and maybe describing what tea, you know, the sort of effects that tea's had on their life. Again, I think you find similar qualities in the way that they describe it, you know. And it's funny because all tonight we were talking about tea as like making its way as a medicine and to the point where it becomes sort of poetic and meditative. You see the same thing in the West. When it arrives in the Dutch Republic in the 1600s, there's a tea craze. And everybody's going, oh my gosh, tea. And part of it must be that, yes, it's a stimulant. And yes, hooray for caffeine. There aren't many caffeinated beverages. And in Europe at that time, there was coffee and cacao were kind of all coming at the same time that tea was coming. So they were all getting stimulated at the same time. But prior to that, people were drinking alcohol as their main source of liquid.
Okay.
Because
Wow.
they didn't. Nobody had the idea that if you boil water, it becomes safe to drink. But if you ferment something in water, it becomes safe to drink, right? Because the fermentation process kills off the little things. So when tea arrives in Europe, it must have just been mind-blowing, because people all of a sudden were going like, wait, this is what sober is? You know? And so what you see in the Dutch Republic, especially, are doctors prescribing tea and describing what it does to the body and what it does to the mind. And it sounds actually very similar to something like Eisai's Kisa Yokoji, you know, where it's like, to make the state strong, you drink tea because it's bitter and it's good for the heart, you know. And that's what we need in Japan, at least in Eisai's Japan, because we like our sour, we like our sweet, we like our umami, you know. We like our spicy, but we don't like our bitter. And tea will give us that bitter, and we will become a stronger nation for that. You see the same thing kind of happen in the Dutch Republic in the 1600s. And then again, you see it in Britain, you know, where it's like a British person drinks tea. That's what makes them strong. That's what makes them a British person. Drink your tea, you know. And I think even nowadays, when you look at what is happening to tea in the 21st century is very similar. It's like, drink your tea, it will make you healthy, right?
Yeah, matcha in the United States is this health food craze.
It's a health, yeah, exactly. And to an extent too, it dovetails into this mindfulness. And I think you've seen, again, a spike in interest in Buddhism, because it is that mindful moment that people are looking for. It's a mindful moment outside of, you know, what I think some folks in this culture either feel disconnected from religion, spirituality, or are connected to a version that may not feel, you know, connected to them. So tea kind of gives somebody that moment to sit down and focus and, you know, do something mindful.
Yeah, I mean, I'm personally not, you know, not a religious person in any way. But tea is a place that I can find this connection to spirit and connection to something larger, and, you know, enjoy the moment, and, you know, and you know, it's I think it's kind of what we've been talking about through all this. It's not within Buddhism. It's not apart from Buddhism. It's all just kind of connected. It's all just different expressions of the same thing in a way.
Yeah.
You know?
Yep.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, again, we could dip very deeply into this, and like, you know, I think wherever tea has touched, you're going to find a very unique story to be told. Kind of a cool thing about tea, and it's a cool thing about food and beverage culture, you know, in general. It's like, we could look at, you know, somebody asked me when I was promoting this online, somebody's like, you know, and don't forget about Christianity and wine. And I'm like, yeah. And Christianity and beer and Gruit and, you know, all these other things. And it's like, you know, there are worldviews that are very much connected to the culture that they come from, and from the food and beverage in that culture. And tea just happens to have a very interesting trajectory that it takes. And it's great that you gave the opportunity today that we could sit, have tea, and have a conversation about this. Maybe next time we'll do it outside of an hour, as we're doing right now, because I think, I mean, this could last for many hours. Someone could do a dissertation on this if they haven't already. So, yeah. So,
but okay, well, yeah, we'll stop it there then. I think my baby needs to go to bed anyway. We have a 5-month-old baby at home.
oh gosh,
so,
that's the meditation.
I think it's bedtime. So
Yeah.
well, Scott, thank you so much. I really appreciate you sharing all your knowledge with us today. And anyone that's watching on our end, seek out Scott for future workshops that he will be doing. If you do a class on this, or but yeah, thank you so much, Scott.
No, thank you, Miles.
Yeah,
Appreciate it.
All right, well, have a good night.
Yeah. Cheers.